Hey everybody, welcome back. Bad Pennies Season 2 is underway. How you been, man?
That's right. Yeah. Well, I had a bout with one of those nasty viruses that went around, and but I'm back.
Yeah, I've had a lot happen in my world these last month or so.
Indeed, and I've had a yet another dear friend pass away, and and it gets me thinking about things, including legacy and a subject that you have brought up.
Yeah. So generations is what we want to talk about today.
Yeah, generations.
Specifically for me, we're talking about like me as a father. I have my father in my life, and I also am a father.
Mm-hmm.
So the dynamic for me is kind of interesting in the sense where like I'm still basically a son to my father, where like I do listen to him and I ask him for advice and whatnot, as a son does, but at the same time I have sons,
right.
And I find myself in a different position with them as their father, and then it's good that my father can kind of step in to kind of fill in a little bit of the gaps that as a father for my sons. So
if he's invited, that's the thing. I mean, we've talked about this before about in parenting, that there's a point in which you can't parent anymore, and it's usually about 15.
So even then, when the kid doesn't listen to the parent, the 15-year-old kid doesn't listen to the parent, they can usually listen to the grandparent.
Well, sometimes, but again, when invited, it doesn't mean that they won't come to you for guidance. And that's generally speaking the best you can hope for, is to be a good guide, right? And if you've done a good job as they move into their 20s and eventually 30s, that they are able to parent themselves, and that they are able to not only guide themselves but get guidance when they need it.
Okay. Yeah.
From the right places.
But when you're getting it from your family, that's where you're able to pass down things within your family, like the family history, the knowledge, the culture, stuff like
but
that.
it has an expiration date, unfortunately, because or not. I mean, it's just there's just a point where if you try to parent after they're 15 or 16, it's offensive to them. The younger that they are, the more parenting they need, right? From when they're born, they need a lot of parenting. They have to. They're very fragile and vulnerable, and so you have to spend a lot of effort and energy protecting them and feeding them and clothing them and all that kind of stuff. The older they get, the less parenting they need. By the time they get to their teens, their mid-teens, they don't really need parenting. And they don't want it. And they're offended when you try to parent them. So and that's a mistake that a lot of parents make, is they continue to parent them even into their 20s and 30s because, I'm your mom or I'm your dad or whatever. And the thing is you gotta. It's so much better for everyone if you just let it go, because if you let it go, you can move into a better place.
Right. And then so now that father then has to go back to his father and say, hey, how did you handle this when
if you need guidance, right? And the thing is that we can go back to our family for guidance. I actually just spent some time with my brother and my nephew.
Okay.
And I hadn't seen my nephew in quite some time, and my brother and I talk a lot, pretty frequently actually, a couple times a week. And but we don't get to see each other because we're 400 miles apart.
Okay.
So it was great to spend some time in a generational kind of situation.
Okay.
Because my brother is 10 years younger than me, and his son is considerably younger than I am, and at almost 30, he's again his own man.
Okay.
And so even though we're very close and it's my brother, it still feels generational in some ways, right? And but you can't, if it's invited, you can give guidance, you can have discussions, but what you can't do is you can't shove wisdom down their throats, and you can't force them to honor the generational gap, because the truth is, and we've always talked about, the generation gap, right? It became very popular in the 60s that there was this generation gap, and so we had everyone doing the whole flower power thing, and growing their hair long, and then we had the older generation that had short hair, and they were going like, oh, the world's coming apart, what's wrong with this new generation? And of course now we're doing the same thing with Gen X and Gen Z, and yes, each generation has its own challenges. Okay, each generation has its own challenges, and the truth is, we're not, as the older generation, necessarily prepared to help them through the new challenges, because we didn't face the same things. They're facing something completely different.
But isn't fundamental wisdom everlasting?
Maybe.
Evergreen?
Well, I don't know. Maybe. Sometimes. Right? I mean,
that's
like, you just stick your finger
thinking.
in an electric socket, that's something bad's going to happen. So that's some fundamental wisdom. I mean, there are certain things, that if you do or don't do, but again, that while you were still in the parenting stage, you've given that to them. Hopefully that they were smart enough, to take it in. And that's the best you can hope as a parent, is that you've given them the tools when they were in the period to absorb them. And sometimes it's just by example.
Right. But what I'm saying is, going back to what you were saying about the world is different now than it was back when they were that age and whatnot. There are some fundamental wisdoms that don't change.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, there are some.
And those are the things that, okay, maybe grandpa may not be able to relate to grandson in a direct way, but whatever the grandson is going through that he may be sharing with the grandfather on and say, this is my problem right now, granddad, then the granddad may be able to put some of that fundamental wisdom into the situation, so that the kid does know what to do, even though it's in his own world, in his own different way.
Yeah, well, sometimes. It's just sometimes. It's not guaranteed. It depends on who and what their experiences are. My grandfather, the things that he taught me were fundamental stuff. Okay. Because when I was a kid, I ran around fast, I talked loud, I talked fast, and clearly some of that hasn't changed. But he would always get me to slow down, quiet down, and be present in the moment.
Okay.
And one of the ways that he did that was he took me fishing.
Okay.
And to this day, some of the most fond memories I have of my grandfather was the time that we spent fishing. And if you're talking about passing down the wisdom, most of that time was spent silent. And yet I got tons out of it.
Yeah.
Okay? I got tons out of it. So, because I was open to it. And I love my grandfather. He was an amazing man. So, but everyone's different and the dynamics are different. So let's just talk a little bit about generations and generational gap in general. Okay?
Okay.
Since you brought it up, right?
Yeah, I did.
You did. Yeah. So we're gonna just dive into it. The world is evolving and has evolved and will continue to evolve. There's nothing we can do about that. Sure. And each generation, as they come along, are faced with a different world in some respects. Now, there may have been periods where things were very similar for a time, but ultimately the world has progressed, and we've got to figure things out. The younger generation going into a changed world with facing different challenges than their parents or their grandparents or their great grandparents faced have to figure stuff out. And sometimes you can go back and, especially if you honor, if your parents did a good job and you trust them and you know that you can rely on them. But look, I did the same thing. I mean, I would talk to my parents, but they often told me shit that just, there's no way I was going to do it. All right. Because it was like, oh my God, this is not going to work. So, but it didn't change how I honored them. And this is the big thing. It isn't about necessarily whether they are human beings in your life, that because they're family, that can actually move you forward or not, because their job is done when you're out. Their job is over. Right? If you have survived childhood unscathed, pretty much, and with enough tools and prepared to go into the world and make your own way and survive, and maybe even start your own family, because of that, you might want to carry a certain reverence for your family and for the generations that came before you. And traditionally in human behavior, that's what we did.
Okay.
In fact, traditionally, and not for everyone, but generally speaking, families, because of the world being what it was, stayed more close-knit. Clans, right? When they were living in more of a
village,
village, or even a wilderness, they had to rely on generations to survive. They had to farmers had lots of children because they needed farmhands.
Yeah.
All right, and because there was nowhere else to go, they stayed on the farm. But today, one of the complaints a lot of farmers, at least generational farmers, talk about is the fact that the kids don't want to stay on farm anymore. They want to go to the city. They want to, they wanted a different life.
Well, not even
and it's
farming.
It's a difficult life working on a farm.
There's plenty of other professions besides farming where the sons don't want to take over the father's business.
My dad wanted me to go into his business, and I had absolutely no desire.
Yeah.
All right. So, but that's one of the benefits of modern society, is that you aren't stuck in the family business. But there was a time where it really wasn't much of an option, unless, of course, you got conscripted into military and had to go to war for, the local lord or whatever, and you didn't get a choice.
Okay.
Right? But outside of that, and see, this is one of the things that has changed our generation, because a little bit during World War I, but World War II in particular, the men and women that went overseas experienced a whole different world. Now, I'm just talking about war. I mean, when the war was over, or when they weren't in the middle of battle or whatever, they were experiencing new cultures and realizing that it is a really big world, and there are a lot of people out there that have different cultures and different ways of thinking and being that are very different than ours, and not wrong. And so they brought a lot of that back. And it began a kind of a cultural shift or transition for this country. Besides the fact that while most of the men went overseas during World War II, the women took their jobs. And what they found was that they were good at it, that they actually could have jobs and raise children and take care of stuff while the men were gone. And it opened their eyes to saying, hey, why am I stuck having the choice of either being a housewife and mom, or a teacher, a nurse, or a secretary? And that was just about all that was available to them. And then all of a sudden they realized that they could do whatever they wanted. And it began an incredible cultural shift. And so, and in that process, again, the way that we look at each generation changed. The old ways of doing things weren't as interesting anymore. because we're in a whole different paradigm. But it doesn't mean, and this is really important, it does not mean that you go forward without honoring and caring about the previous generations. Because, so often I've seen, men and women turning their back on it or thinking that it was wrong. It was just a different time. It's not wrong. Nobody's wrong. Even right now, we're struggling with some real challenges that this new paradigm, in this 21st century, is bringing us, including again a breakdown of the family.
Right.
And the breakdown of the family
is not a good thing.
Is actually costing us.
Yeah.
It's costing us.
So that's what was my whole point about the generation sticking together. When the grandfather and the father and the son can all work together, it's
a possibility. It may or may not be something that you want, but it is a possibility, and there's value in it. And again, the turning our back on previous generations and what they had to go through means that you may actually lose some of the value and the wisdom that they have to give. And why would you do that, right? I mean, because I think any intelligent, conscious human being would not want to lose things just because things have changed, right?
Okay.
All right, so it doesn't mean you have to do things the same way they did, but it also means that they may have learned some things that you may not have to go through. Okay, so let's just back up. 2 ways to learn.
2 ways to learn.
2 ways to learn. All right. One is the most popular way to learn, which is failure.
Okay.
Okay. That's the most common way. I didn't say popular way, but it's certainly the most common way, is that we make mistakes and we learn from the mistakes.
Right.
So we fail, and then we figure out why we failed, decide how to do it different, and jump into that, and maybe we'll fail again. But again, the human learning process is mostly from a process of failure and learning and then moving on, right? Most of our learning process. Okay. But it's not our only learning process. The other way is to learn from someone else's mistakes. All right? It's and strangely enough, we avoid that often. I mean, we don't want to, it's like someone else went through the whole process, and rather than figuring out what they did so we don't go through that, I'm going to do it my way. It's like we've got all of this lone wolf. By the way, watch our lone wolf podcast, okay? Lone wolf or pack wolf. But the lone wolf wants to learn it your way, do it your way. And so then you're just going to repeat mistakes. And the generational context is where you can actually learn some things from the previous generations, from your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, if you're lucky enough to have them around, and appreciate the learning that they took on when they made a mistake, when they failed, and what it was that they learned out of that got them to a point of success. Another way of looking at it, didn't we do a thing on mentors?
Yes.
We did a thing. Look at the mentor podcast too.
Season 1.
Yeah.
It's there.
So the lineage of father to son to son to son to son, there's a legacy involved in that. And the only time that there's legacy is when the knowledge is passed forward.
Right.
If the knowledge isn't passed forward, then the legacy is lost. Right? And sometimes it's lost because instead of embracing the learning and the knowledge, it's just looked at as from a historical standpoint. In other words, just they did it. I don't have to go through that because they did it. Yeah. But the thing is that's you will make the mistake. You will make the same mistakes. Yeah. So legacy can be a very valuable thing to a man because he won't have to necessarily make the same mistakes. and he can take it from a point that his father, his grandfather brought it to this point, and then his father brought it to this point, and then now he's going to take it from there and take it to this point, and his son will take it from there and take it to this point. And I think that's maybe where when you were thinking generational, that's really what we're talking about here.
Yeah, but yes, exactly, but more on a whole life spectrum, not necessarily like just business, but I'm just saying like just the identity of the grandfather does exist in the grandson.
It does, and the if you look at how the world actually works, we don't always get that opportunity, because decisions are made, life changes. People came over, left their families in Europe to come here for a better life. They left things behind. They left people behind. They left family behind, and then even here they traveled long distances to get somewhere that they thought would promise a better life. And in the process, they lost family. The older people died. They got sick, or people, all kinds of things happened to them. So, and that transition meant that they eventually, when they land, they're starting over. They're starting over. So it's not the whole, family staying together forever. Sure, it has definitely been a traditional historical way of being because we needed to.
Okay. So in the next episode, what I want to ask you about, we're going to get to that right after this, is because now I'm at this thing where I'm thinking legacy may be not as important as I think.
Well, so you want to talk about legacy?
In the next episode.
In the next one? All right, so we're going to pick up
all that
generations.
Passing down legacy.
Generations and legacy.
See where I want to go now. All right, cool.
Okay.
We'll be back. Bad Pennies. It's okay. We're going to ignore that.
Oh, your phone.
Yeah.
We got a video going on here. So, you want to stop that? Or is it?
We're going to go past it. And we're going to keep going. Because what that is it's actually a commercial break in my timer.
Really? We need to have commercial breaks.
We need to get followers in order to get commercial breaks.
Okay, all right. Well, more followers. Tell your friends.